So today we're going to talk about learning new languages. We're not going to talk as much about how to as a plan for it. We're going to call it a roadmap for learning development languages, much like you would do a roadmap for a product, for a career plan, or anything else that is a long-term, set of goals and objectives that you want to put together. And this is for career advancement. Because although we love languages, we love developing, we love learning new languages, we think this is always a cool thing when we've got whatever the new language of du jour is. It also, besides being fun, it's a way to advance our career. A junior level developer is not going to be expected to know too many languages. By the time you get to being a senior developer, there's an expectation that you know at least, I would say, a half dozen languages, and probably closer to a dozen. I used to feel like that was a lot, but when you look at it these days and you look at what shows up on a regular job posting for requirements of knowledge and experience, and then the nice to haves, it often easily gets into double digits when you consider the languages like, and if you consider as a language like CSS and SQL and JavaScript, and in a sense, like React is a little different from core JavaScript, or Dojo, or or Angular, whatever the JavaScript framework is, as well as whatever the core language is for that, whether it's a C# or Java or PHP. And then there's usually, hey, it'd be nice to know, some sort of shell scripting, maybe some of these sort of like tool languages, like how to work with Maven or how to work with Ant. And you start racking up languages pretty fast at that point. And there's usually a lot of stuff where you've got a project that you're doing, and there's some core language, there's languages to get that core project done, but then there's these integrations. So you have to have some knowledge, or at least it's helpful to have knowledge in all of these other things. Again, it's like, if you just look at the stack it's got here, it's, HTML is going to show up everywhere. XML, you almost have to know for any kind of data movements. SQL if you're doing anything with the database, CSS if you're doing anything on a front end, JavaScript if you're doing anything on a web front end. It's becoming something where you just have to keep learning languages. I want to add a mind-blowing deep thought as I was looking at stuff. This was actually talking about spoken languages, but it's really interesting when you consider development languages. And it starts off with, you can never understand one language until you understand at least two. And when you think about it from a development language point of view, I think that is just as true as it is with any spoken language. When you think about it, and you think about just the conversations that we've had in the mentor classes that you've had at lunches and things like that, when you're with other technical people, how often do you essentially define what you're doing or relate what you're doing in multiple languages, and that you talk about maybe in this language or in this framework or in this platform I could do X, but now I'm in this other language, and so I'm trying to do it, and it's a little different. But you do now understand that problem a little bit better, because you will understand, even with the core pieces of a language, it is a lot easier to understand how like collections work when you know how to do it in a couple different languages, or how threads or looping mechanisms or all of the things that we do. It's not until you've done it a couple of times in a couple different languages that you start really being able to abstract that into what is the theory, what is really behind the scenes, and get it separated from the syntax. So it's, among other things, for all the other reasons we talked about learning languages, the more languages you learn, I think the better you're really going to understand core programming language concepts. As I started out with this, one tool is just not enough anymore. There used to be days where you could be a COBOL programmer or an RPG programmer or a C programmer, and that was it. You could write applications all day in that language, and there are people, I think, that probably went their whole career, they knew that one language. Y2K was probably a good example, because for those of you that aren't old enough to remember, year 2000, everybody used 2-digit years, And so suddenly and assume that the first two digits were 19. Well, when you got to the year 2000, the first two digits are not a 19. Now the first two digits are a 20. And there's a lot of issues with that. And most of the code at that time, or large, huge, vast amounts of code, had been written in COBOL. And the COBOL programmers that had written that were really getting close to retirement age. So their last hurrah, their like retirement run was in the late 90s, where they were able to bill a huge amount of money, great rates, doing something they had done for their career to essentially adapt, correct for this design flaw that had existed for decades at that point, because nobody thought any application would live more than a few years anyways. Well, they went in, made all those changes, and these were people that was all they did. They'd done COBOL. They didn't learn anything, any of the newer languages or anything like that. And for them, it sort of worked out well because they were able to do this last push, do a lot of work, get a great rate, and then pretty much you're done, because nobody was doing COBOL after that. I mean, there just wasn't much of it, or not enough of it to keep that a huge amount of developers busy. And even today, there are people doing COBOL, but it's definitely a small and niche and probably dying out kind of group. So you just can't get away with one language anymore. And of course, back to that quote, if you only know one language, it's sort of like if you're a carpenter, you only know if all you have is a hammer, then everything is a nail. And with software development, that is sort of a rookie mistake you see with a lot of early developers, is they don't really have experience. They don't have a lot of different languages to choose from. So every problem, they almost are forced to essentially solve it roughly the same way. But then when you start adding these new languages on, you add the ability to solve things in new and interesting ways, and maybe more useful ways. And then, of course, the problems we're solving now are becoming more complex, and every year, every month, probably even. And in order to solve them, just having the equivalent of a hammer is not enough. There's just things that you do that there's a certain point where, you can try to hammer your way through everything, but it becomes really difficult. Like if you're using a hammer to beat apart 2x4s as a saw, as opposed to getting a saw, you sort of make that work. But when you're trying to build intricate, wood carvings or something like that, well, you just really can't do it. And so same thing with programming languages. The stuff that we're trying to do has grown to a level where you've just got to understand concepts more than just a language. All right, so I'm going to assume that you guys are all sold on it. It's like, yep, good, love it, move on. We all want to, know more languages. All right, so now what do we do? Well, the best developers out there that I've experienced, when I'm talking about how they got there, they've got a plan. They have some sort of an intentional path that they're taking to learn new languages. And they have for quite a while. And it basically is a roadmap. Just like you would have a roadmap of features for a product, this is essentially a roadmap of features for your development skills. And having this roadmap, having this a plan, allows us to get to that goal faster, because we can find ways that we can maybe double up on work. We've talked before about complementary languages. We've talked about keeping an eye out for opportunities to learn new things. When you've got that roadmap, that gives you like a checklist, a to-do list that you can keep referring back to, and maybe find some good opportunities to, to double up, or to, kill two birds with one stone in learning a new language, plus maybe helping out your company in a new and innovative way. Similar to that is, it's very useful to have this if you're going to do side hustle work of any kind for your personal projects. If you've got this roadmap of technologies or skills that you're trying to work with, then that's a great place to look for ways or tools to implement these side hustle and personal projects. Personal projects in particular, because if you screw it up completely, that's okay. It becomes a perfect learning environment to try to build an application in a new language. And we talked about that when we talked about ways to learn new languages. Well, if you've got, ideally, you've got somewhere a list of some personal projects, things that you would like to do at some point. It's a product idea that you've got. You're like, oh, this would be really cool. Well, some point where you're sitting down and saying, all right, I'm going to spend, the next 3 months, 6 months, year working on something. I want to work on a personal project. Go look at the list of personal projects, look at the list of your development language roadmap. And maybe there's some things that are on that roadmap where you say, oh, hey, if I go do this project in Ruby, then that's going to be a great excuse for me to learn Ruby, play around with it, get comfortable with it, have a product, under my belt in it, as opposed to just sort of, digging around for random languages. If you've got a plan, then you can find some ways to do that a little bit better. And particularly if you're doing, as we are, you're probably going to be advancing in multiple languages at a time. So when you've got a roadmap, it may be something where you look at it and say, I don't really know Ruby real well, and I don't know React. So I'm going to go do Ruby and React, and I can actually use both of those in building out my project. Start with is just a really simple approach in building your roadmap. Look at what you know, and essentially what that by default gives you sort of what you don't know. So if you look at what you know, with those, there's going to be things that like cold. You've got them 100%. You don't need to spend any more time on it. There's probably going to be some other things where you would like to learn them more deeply. Maybe there's some frameworks or some libraries. Maybe you just haven't done a lot of applications with them. So you may want to use those, and some of those, let's say, advancing your skills in those languages, you may want to put that on your roadmap. And then, of course, with that, you want to look at like new languages to you, which we'll call those your, like core or bang for your buck kind of languages. Like, these are going to be things that we really want that are really going to add to our value. There's also some helper and related languages that are, some languages that are maybe not in the core, but are some things that you're going to want to put on that roadmap. There may be some boutique languages or special project kind of things. You also want to take a look at those, because those sort of help round out, along with the last one there, fillers, the types of languages that that are out there. There's what there's the things that everybody that are popular that everybody should know. There's the secondary things, your JavaScripts, your CSSs that help really add flavor to your ability to solve problems. And then you get into the things that are just like nice little tools, and then the boutique type languages, like specific to a platform, like Salesforce scripting or NetSuite scripting, or some of those kinds of things. Starting with the reviewing what I know, you've got some core languages, at least one, we're going to assume. What are them? What are the ones that you have? And by core languages, I'm talking like the ones that are really popular, that are in your top 5 or top 10 of languages being used. When you think about it, it's like, well, how well do I know it? And this is, for each of those, it makes sense to look at that and then consider like the libraries and the frameworks and the ways that is being used, because that may help you inform where you need to learn. And then once you've got you got a good picture of what you know, do essentially a gap analysis and think about the comfort you have with that language to figure out, do I need to do some more work in it? It sort of gives you a good snapshot of not only what you know, but a little bit of, with what I know alone, without adding new things, what's some additional work I want to do, or some additional learning I need to do with that. When I talk about helper languages and things like that, these are often going to be things that are used as scripting as part of a tool that are not specific to that tool. So, for example, Salesforce has ForceScript, I think is what they call it. And it is sort of a JavaScript, but it's really very proprietary. But then also, if you look out there, there's a lot of languages that are actually used for internally within languages that are just a language to itself, and you can use it in a lot of different places. Great example of that is XML, that it shows up everywhere. But also, you're seeing a lot of tools now that have like the underlying scripting work that you can do are in Lisp or Python. There's a few others I've seen, but those are, and actually I guess I've seen a few that are Ruby, where just learning that language will help you configure and manipulate a lot of tools. So it helps you out in getting the job done. This can include, and things you want to consider is like markup languages, obviously like XML, HTML, VRML, all of the MLs, all the markup languages. And then think about like your scripting languages, which are shell script kind of stuff, or batch, the DOS command line kind of DOS batch or Windows batch or PowerShell commands, things like that. And then the full languages like a Lisp or a Python, where you could actually do a full-blown application, but it also is a nice little helper language to have. When you're thinking about helpers, they may just be frameworks or language-specific tools, which is sort of where like React and Angular, all of the JavaScript stuff sort of fall into that. Framework-wise, maybe like Spring, if you're a Java developer, maybe Spring, or Hibernate, those kinds of tools. Think about, there's also going to be, as you're thinking about what you want to put on your roadmap, you may want to include different versions and vendor variants. Java was famous, and it still sort of is, for having some major changes from every few versions. Java 1 was a huge difference from Java 2. And then they did sort of like Java 3, 4, 5, and then 6 was, suddenly there was a big deal. And then with 9, they made some huge changes. So those kinds of things are maybe where you want to look at some places you want to expand your experience. Vendor variants. There are some languages, particularly like the mobile implementations of like a Java or .NET, things like that. There's some libraries and even some functionality that's going to vary from platform to platform. So if you're working with, like, SQL is a good example, probably the best. If you use SQL with Oracle, it is very different from using it in SQL Server or MySQL. And there's some similarities across all of them, but there's a usefulness in understanding the vendor variants of it on each of those. And although I mentioned across mobile apps, also, you'll see at times a very big difference between mobile versus desktop implementations of a library by its very nature. It's getting better with mobile, but for the longest time, that's why you had Java, J2ME, the micro edition of Java was basically the standard edition, SE, and they yanked out a ton of libraries. And so you had a whole different, where you could do a lot of stuff with the desktop edition, the standard edition. When you went to mobile, there's a lot of things that it didn't have out of the box. So it's a different thought process to get into those, and worth taking a look at those and putting those on your roadmap. The bang for your buck languages, the main ones, these are the languages that can advance your career. These are usually going to be in like the top 5 or top 10 of popular languages, just geographically or globally, but also these are going to be things that may not be yet in that top tier, but you see them in job postings a lot. So it may be like an up and coming type language that's currently real hot, hasn't been around long enough to make break the top 5 or the top 10, but you realize that if I know that language, I can improve my abilities of landing a job. Besides job articles, it may be something you've seen a lot of posts and articles and magazines and things like that. It's just got a lot of buzz around it, essentially. And you think at this point, you're really sort of projecting that, okay, if I know this, then 3 to 6 months from now, I'm going to start seeing a lot of jobs open up that are looking for this. And of course, popular languages in recent years, you can look at what was the most popular language last year or the year before. And with that, you maybe want to look at some trends, because you can look in the top 5 or top 10 and see if there's some things that are trending towards disappearing. And you look in maybe the top 20 or top 30 and look for some things that are trending towards, they'll probably be in the top 10 or the top 5 in, the next few years. As I mentioned, look for trends. Some recent trends would be things like Internet of Things, mobile, cloud. These are things that we hear all the time. Languages and platforms that work with those are are hot. Those are good things to do to advance your career. I mentioned the top 5. I would work with the top 5 popular languages, which are going to be the vast majority of jobs, and then work your way down into the top 10 as part of your roadmap. I haven't mentioned yet, but something that you should definitely consider is geography and the industry you're in. If you're in the Northeast of United States Northeast, the languages that are popular there and that are going to be your best bets are different from what are going to be in South Florida, which are different from what are going to be out in Silicon Valley. And then depending on where you're at, also like healthcare languages are going to be the ones that are really popular in healthcare are different from the ones that are popular in finance, are different from the ones that are popular in scientific programming, are different from the ones that are in web programming. So where you want your career to be should also inform your roadmap. If you want to work with like embedded systems, you're going to have a very different roadmap that will be valuable to you than somebody that wants to work on web applications. When you're thinking about what you're putting on your roadmap and sort of prioritizing it, think about what you're going to have to review a little bit and do some research, but figure out what is like the focus of that language. What's the best use of that language? Some are obvious. SQL is, you're going to have a database. You're working with the database. HTML, if you're out on the web. But then look at these others that maybe it's not as obvious what Python does best, what Ruby does best, what Java does best, or C or C++. And some of these don't do one or two things best. What they do best is be a general language. But then there's a lot of languages that do certain things. They solve certain problems. That is their wheelhouse. That is what they do best with. Another thing to take a look at that I think is sort of fallen by the wayside in the last 5 or 10 years, but I think is very valuable for like a long-term roadmap and figuring out what really is valuable to you is where you can, if you can, figure out, is this like a millennial language that all the developers are basically young and pretty new to the scene? Is this something that's a legacy language where most of the developers are in their 50s and 60s and pushing their way to retirement? Because there's different reasons, there's different value in doing those. Maybe you want to be the only person left in the world that knows how to code COBOL, because you'll get a little bit of work here and there, but you'll be able to charge ridiculous rates. Or there may be some language that is sort of, it's still there, it's still going to be popular enough, but the workforce for it is falling away. On the flip side, maybe this is something that it's not being used a whole lot, but there's so many developers that use it that that there's just going to be that momentum is going to carry it through to it is going to be popular in the next 5 or 10 or even 20 years. So think of all of that as you're trying to figure out what to put on your roadmap and putting some priorities to it, some values to it. When I talk about the like boutique or special project languages or the niche kind of languages or niche, if you want to go that route, these are ones that they're not in the top 10. They're never, ever going to be in the top 10 popular languages. So even though like SQL is sort of a niche because it's database applications, since everybody uses a database application, it's not niche. These languages, there's going to be more risk in learning something that never is used in your job, but there's also a lot of potential for you to be able to, because that, land jobs you never would have. An example from my past is that I spent time on Steve Jobs when he was between jobs at Apple, created a thing called Next. And it was these really cool machines that were really the iMacs before the iMacs existed. And there was the Next operating system, which now is essentially OS X, but they had Objective-C, and they had their own little bit of libraries. Again, much like what, Mac took a lot of that kind of stuff. But there was a value in that because I had worked on some machines when I was in college, and I got calls specifically on a couple of occasions over the years that were saying, hey, can you come out to this job because we saw that you've used Next before and we have a couple of, we have some machines here. And so, sometimes there's those niche kind of things we're going to get you a job that you otherwise wouldn't. And they may be dying languages. So it may be, COBOL is really sort of becoming a niche kind of thing. So maybe if you know it, there's the ability for you to get a job. And maybe it's not a bad job, because it may be something where there's a company that wants to convert all of their COBOL to .NET. And so it's a perfect, time for you to get some, get in the door, use those COBOL skills a little bit, knock some rust off of them, but also really advance your skills in .NET. A lot of the boutique type languages, they've got a very tightly focused usage, but it's worth it for the projects that they're building them on. You can see that with a lot of the scientific languages like Fortran. It really has become sort of a niche, even though there's a lot of people using it, but it is very good for the types of projects that you often see people work with. A more popular or current modern thing would be like Unity and some of the game development languages. They are, they're not something you're going to want to use to write you probably could, but you don't want to write like a raw CRUD, database application to store customer information. But for doing games, obviously that's where you want to go. Like I said, and some of these, just a little bit of experience may be enough to just say, hey, I can put it on my resume and that's going to help me out. Maybe you don't need to get too deep into it. So, these are good languages if you just want to like expand, but you don't want to you've got like a month or a couple months to just play around with the language, get exposed to it, get enough that you feel like, okay, I know where its strengths are. I know something about its weaknesses. I have a feel for what this language is like, enough that if I ever get to a point where I'm called on, I know how to get started with it. And I can say, yeah, I can talk somewhat intelligently about it. And the final thing is a lot of these will be, or some of these you'll find are industry specific, like the HL7 in healthcare is understanding that, that format, or how ACH payments are delivered and some of the formatting of that. So those examples are really formats more than languages, but there are some languages that go with those as well that you'll find in certain industries where it's like, this is the only place this language is being used because it is so specific to doing that kind of work, which would be sort of like Unity in the gaming industry. You don't find it anywhere else because it does its job, and pretty much that's it. Fillers they're going to add some color to your language experience. And again, they probably aren't even going to be up to general or niche. They have very, usually for small projects or small applications, I think of shell scripting languages, T-shell, corn shell, all of those guys. If you understand Maven, it's really more of a configuration than a language. Ant is sort of the same way, but those two, Tickle, I've seen that a lot of times. It's useful if you're doing some simple, like maybe some Unix command line language, command line apps. Awk, sed, some extent like grep, some of those kinds of things that are fine, that are really like they're really using Unix command line tools, but they are almost a little bit of a language unto themselves. Definitely the shell scripting languages are, but you can even throw in like potentially like, crons and being able to program those and configure those. Those are like the fillers. These are the things that aren't really a full-blown language, but it wouldn't hurt to put it on your roadmap to say, hey, I need to understand how to do this. I need to understand Ant. I need to understand corn shell. I need to understand make, things like that. These tend to be they're like helpers to you early on in your career, but as you get further on, they're almost like a requirement. And as you get further in your career and you get experience with these little helper languages, they can dramatically improve your ability to get your job done. The ability to take these things and automate tasks that you do on a regular basis, a lot of times can be the things that differentiate a mid-level from a senior developer, or a mid-level from a junior, because the people that have the higher skill level with these are able to get jobs done faster. The things that are detail-oriented, time suck kind of tasks that you do on a daily basis, administrative kind of things, you can use these tools, these fillers, to get that stuff done faster and probably with a higher quality because you can take some of the human error out of it. You want some real power? Look at like parsers and generators. There's some code generators out there. There's some parsing and understanding how to use those languages can be a huge step in getting projects done. I can't really, it's beyond the scope to talk about them at this, but definitely if you don't know what those are, if you've never dealt with any of those, it's worth playing around with, doing a little research on what those kinds of things will do, what they provide for you. So it's definitely a different mental focus on how to use them, but I think it's once that light bulb goes on, you're like, oh, okay, I can see where this would be very powerful. The bonus with all of these fillers is that they're a nice touch on your resume. It's another thing when we come across these recruiters that are really like just, they're searching databases and they're looking for keywords. Well, you get to have one of these little keywords on your resume, and that bumps up the likelihood that they'll talk to you. Maybe you don't want that to happen, but hey, you never know when your dream job is going to come from some random thing that you've got on your resume that is the thing that bumped you above everybody else on the list. So with all of this, it may sound like work, but have some fun. When you're building your roadmap, look at what's out there and what is useful to you to learn. And then there's going to be some things that you probably are going to have more fun learning that you want to learn. So bias your roadmap towards the things you want to do. Don't be a slave to your career. Allow your career to be something that enables you to go out there and do the things you want to do. I highly recommend that you create tools as you go through all of this. Use these languages as you're working your way through your roadmap. Build, and we've talked about this for like a repository of tools and applications and problems solved so that you are making your life easier, so that you're doing things that make it easy for you to get your job done, especially the things you don't like to do, so you can focus on the things that you do like to do. Don't be afraid to jump into to create a game or do something that helps you with your hobby as part of your side projects and personal projects and some of the things you do. I've talked to people before about like building an application that would allow somebody to keep track of score in dart games and use that at a bar so they could keep track of the people that are, like a dart tournament. Talk to somebody about building score tracking for bowlers, to basically to keep track of their scores and their averages and their handicaps and things like that. There's a lot of stuff that you could do around like baseball is like a perfect stat game. There's so many stats in it. I've talked to people about hockey and keeping track of those stats. Maybe you want to build a game, whether it's something simple like a Tetris or a Minesweeper, or something like a full-blown RPG or first-person shooter or something like that, or a board game. Maybe you love Monopoly and you want to go create a new little Monopoly app that you can play against yourself or with your family. Don't be afraid to have some fun along the way. I haven't mentioned, and I rarely do, but I do want to mention in this time, is that as you're thinking about this kind of stuff, don't forget about like applications that also are languages, like Access and FileMaker. These are things, and even Visual Basic Scripting, the VBA. There's things out there that are really valuable to know to some extent, and they may be full-blown projects in themselves. And they also may be a good excuse for you to go tackle one of those games or hobbies that you have. So don't forget that there's things out there beyond just the development languages. There's some other ways that you can essentially add to your development language roadmap these tools and these platforms. And then throw ideas out to others. Ask other people what they think. What are some suggestions they have? People that know you in particular, or they're in your industry. So whether it's coworkers or people you meet at conferences, friends and family that have any kind of technical input. It's try to find things that make sense for your career. Like what would, maybe even go to your boss and say, well, here's what I know. What would be some good things for me to know a year from now or 3 years from now in the directions that we're going? What are maybe some things that are on the organizational roadmap that would point me to learning a specific language or specific platform or framework? So now we've got like a big old list of languages. Let's talk about actually building your roadmap. Start with your core, which goes back to really the first point is like, what do I have? What do I know? With what I know, I want to build out of that initially because there is that idea of momentum of each language that you add, each successive language gets easier and easier. So let's start baby steps, essentially, sort of close to what we know. So you can go back to where that list of maybe there's some additional things within the languages you know where you can reinforce those, where you can add some new libraries or maybe a new approach to it or a new platform to use that language in a different platform or a different version. Maybe I know version 2, but I want to learn version 3. And while I'm doing that, let's sprinkle in some new things that you want to expose yourself to. They may be those helper languages. Those are always real easy to sprinkle in. But maybe it is a major language. So maybe you want to just do like I think they still have like learn C++ in 24 hours or master Java in a weekend, those kind of things that they don't live up to what the title says, but they are a good way to get into a crash course of learning a new language. There's also a lot of sites out there like Udemy and Safari and all of these other sites that are out there that they have tutorials. They've got access to online books. They've got projects and code samples. There's a bunch of YouTube stuff out there that are tutorials. Obviously, we've done stuff at Developreneur. There's just all these different ways that you can go out there and you can spend, a little time here, a little time there, and start learning new stuff. And it's a good way to also sort of like dip a toe in is to test these things out. Do I really want to learn Ruby? Maybe I do, maybe I don't. So if I start working my way through it, maybe I realize halfway in, it's like, I'm going to try to go the rest of my career not dealing with this. And so you bail out on it and strike it off your roadmap. As you're building it out, remember that you also want to stay current. So you don't want to put so much new stuff in that you're not able to still go back and occasionally touch the things that you know currently. And as you're building it out, you also want to have, like, if you're building out all these little projects you want to do and where your job wants to go, you may occasionally need to throw something in there that does harken back to your language you know now. Maybe you're really good at Java right now and you start going down the path of learning Ruby and .NET and PHP and C++ and all of this other stuff. Well, a year from now, if you've been doing all these other things and haven't been in Java, maybe it's a good time to just say, hey, I want to go back and return to Java, maybe learn like a new version of it or play around in a specific library or framework that is added to it. So I can reinforce those core Java skills, but also advance my skills as well. That allows you to stay current, but also grow. Don't be afraid to mix the types of projects you're working on, particularly if you've got a day job and a night job. I have found this, and this may be difficult for some people, so this may be a personal thing, but I found it is very helpful to have, like, in my day job, one thing that I'm focused on, and in my side projects, something different. For example, in my day job, if I'm working on, let's say, Windows applications in C#, it's very refreshing to come home at night or work on the weekend on web applications in PHP, something like that, so that you don't feel like you're getting in a rut. If instead I was doing C# during the week and then building web applications in C# during the weekend, my C# skills would really be sharp, no pun intended, although actually it was a pun intended, but although I would really be getting deep into those C# skills, I think I'd feel like I was getting into rut. I'd get bored at some point. So like, gosh, there's got to be more out there. So, don't be afraid to like mix it up a little bit and do very different languages, very different things that you're working on as your special project, because I think it does help keep everything sort of new and fresh to you. And as you're building out your roadmap, because one of the goals is to advance your career, look at what your employment, your job, the company that you work for, what are some of the goals that you've laid out there? What are some plans that you have there in that job? And maybe long-term career goals and plans. how does this roadmap of languages you're going to learn help you get to achieve those goals and, fulfill those plans that you've laid out? Make sure that what you've done is not done in a vacuum, but it's done so that the work that you're putting in your day job and your side projects and your side hustle and all the different things you're doing with this, trying to make it sure that that's why we're building this roadmap, trying to make sure that they align so that you're not fighting against yourself and, am I working on my career or am I working on building my skill set? Hopefully you're doing both at the same time. In the end, it's also going to be more productive because then you're not having to do quite as much work. You're getting a little bit of economy of scales of being able to work on both your career and your skill set at the same time. So final thoughts on this. As you're building a roadmap, start with your core and build a strong core. Just like if you're going out and you're trying to if you want to go become like a marathon runner or football player or something like that, you always start with the core muscles, the core strength. Same thing with your development languages. Get a strong core. The things that are languages that you can go just about anywhere in the world with that skill and get a job, work on a project. No matter what somebody gives you, you can do that project in that language. It may not be the best choice, but at least you can. And then from there, start working on increasing your productivity. Look at like scripting and helper languages and additional libraries and frameworks that are not necessarily, they may be part of that sort of like offshoots of that top 5, those core languages, but maybe not. Maybe these are just ways to help you work in that core better. As always, steady progress is going to be as important as anything. Just keep chugging away at it. Try to, learn a little bit. If you can't learn a little bit every day, make it a goal to at least learn a little bit, something new every week, because that's going to help you build that momentum and build the habits to get this done. And in the long run, be really impressed with what you've accomplished. Don't forget to stay fresh. There's going to be some languages that will just sort of drop off of your skill set because you don't like them or there's just no jobs with them or anything like that. But there's the things that are still living languages where there are projects out there. Every so often, just go, even if it's like just take a few hours to go review some code or go play around with an application you wrote years ago in some odd language and maybe debug an issue in it or something like that. Just something to keep those skills fresh. And you don't have to do that like on a regular basis as much. Maybe once a year you come back and you just look at what's out there. Is there some languages that now you look at it and say, it's on my resume, but man, I don't remember anything about it. And just go spend enough time to just freshen up your knowledge a little bit. So if you do end up running across it in a conversation or, heaven forbid, an interview question, that you're current enough that you can talk about it. And you can always admit, say, I'm a little rusty in that, but it's enough that you can impart the idea that you do know it, that you could do something with it. And also, so that you're comfortable enough reaching back to that if you find a project where that skill is a perfect match, that you can go back and pull that forward and say, I'm going to go do that in Delphi that I haven't used in a decade because I know that's the best way to do this. Any questions, comments, thoughts?
There's a friend of mine who was asking me, and since you talked about new languages, and he told me like if I guess maybe and maybe I'm coming from a different professional, let me say accounting, and I want to learn, for instance, a new language. Let me say Java. So how many hours would he or she have to put in? Based on you, having experience in Java, how many hours should they put in? He told me he doesn't mind, but as long as he has a rough estimate, let me say 360 hours, then maybe they can budget their time accordingly. How many hours would you think a person can master, let me say, core Java or maybe C# or something like that? And it's completely new into computers, a different major, never had anything about programming.
That's going to be really tough because there's just, I honestly believe there's some people that are just not programmers. They're not, their makeup is such that they just don't think that way. Just like there's some people that aren't artists. They just, their way their brain structure is they just don't do that. They're never going to be able to be free to do art. The same way there's some people who are never going to be analytical enough to do coding. So some people are going to be very natural to it. And it's again, it's like, enough to just do an application. You could probably get, you probably could get enough in, maybe, I don't know, 150, 200 hours, something like that. If you spend if you spend a month working on it, maybe not even that much, but yeah, probably. I mean, if you've never done programming before, you could probably get to the point where you could put together a simple application. Probably wouldn't be very pretty or anything like that. And, maybe as little, and maybe even a little less than that, but I would say at least 150, 200 hours. If you're talking about getting to the point where you could actually, get a job doing that, yeah, then you're probably talking, probably closer to 500 hours or something like that. I think you got to think about it as if somebody was working full time to learn a language. I would think by the time for them to get to the point where they could actually do a job, like an entry level job in programming, they're probably going to need to spend at least 6 months to a year. And if you look at most of boot camps that start at 0 and say, okay, you don't have to know anything. The best ones, I think, the fastest ones are 12 to 16 weeks of full time, and that's including it's 8-hour classes and then homework and stuff like that. So you got to figure, probably 50 to 60-hour weeks for 12 weeks. I mean, that puts you at 700 hours right there. So I think, you're probably talking then to get a job, probably 500 to 1,000 hours, depending on the person.
Okay. I mean, that's a good estimate because I didn't know how to answer. I just said yes and yes. And
learning is, when you're in that learning thing, it is going to very much, the amount of hours you put in is going to be very different if you're putting in an hour a day to get to that point versus putting in 8 hours a day, because it's just so much that it's getting to the point of getting your thinking to work within that language, as opposed to just trying to figure out syntax and stuff like that. So that's why you look at it as most people that are really, really solid entry-level developers have just come out of college programs where they probably spent, I would say, minimum 500 to 700 hours a year for 4 years at least. So you're talking at least in the 1,500 to 2,000 hours range. Now, granted, that's multiple languages and a true, there really should be on the path to a true software developer. But, there's and that was immersing, that's really immersing in becoming a developer. That's the challenge with it. And that's why the boot camps will get you there to some extent, but really just get to the point where maybe you can get that first job, and then from there spend some time really developing your skills. So what we learned, as always, what have we learned today? Well, a development language roadmap is key to your career development. And it's just, not to be redundant using development over and over again, but it really is if you're in IT, if you're a software developer, a big part is going to be really advancing your skills in languages. Yes, as we've talked about before, the best developers, what they're doing is they're able to solve more complex, tougher problems faster. They're getting better solutions in a shorter period of time. But part of doing that is getting a really wide tool set that they can work from, so that they can get all of these things done, so that they can build automation around some of the administrative tasks that take so much time when you're an entry-level developer. You can make forward steps every day while becoming more productive. I think that's where those helper languages are huge. If you find a task, and I think we've referred to this before, if you find a task that you do on a regular basis that's very manual and has a good chance of being automated, that's also a good opportunity for you to grab one of these languages, learn how to use it, and automate the task. That was the ANT presentation that we did a month or two ago, really came out of that, is that there was a bunch of stuff I was doing, and I realized ANT could do that kind of stuff for me. So instead of me, even though sometimes it was, entering 4 or 5 commands on a line and letting it run, I was able to use ant, and then it became one command, and I just did that and off and running. Those kinds of things will allow you to get stuff done faster, and you don't have to worry about typos as much and all that kinds of other stuff. So you can easily make forward step progress every day. Bottom line, the good and the bad news, there is no finish line. There are more languages every day coming out. There's always new stuff to learn. There's always new versions. There's always new libraries. And you can put together a roadmap of a 5 or 10-year roadmap, but you're going to come back to it regularly, and there's going to be new stuff that pops up. And there may be some things that actually drop off because nobody ever uses those anymore. So the sooner the better that you get into that habit of regular forward progress, because when you do, that's just going to make you a better developer. You're going to go from junior to mid-level to senior to guru or whatever it happens to be, and you're going to be able to stay at that top level for a longer period of time because you're going to have the habits in place that are that constant learning that you need. As always, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thanks for listening. Thank you for your feedback. All of these are greatly appreciated. As always, there's many ways we can think of for you to get a hold of us. Email at info@developreneur.com. Go out and contact us on our website. Follow us on Twitter. Check us out on the Facebook site. Even with Facebook and all of the changes they're making, Developerpreneur page is still there so far, and we're still able to post to it on a regular basis, and we do so. We're just going to keep on keeping on, make our forward progress, and try to make us, everyone, better every day.